Thank you, Sheriff. Tell me the people that are seated at the end of the row right there, would you like to turn the desk a little bit so you can see them? You're probably okay. How's that for you? You can move your chairs around. You can even sit on the other side of him if you need to. I know that some of y'all may mention that. Welcome back. You will recall that this witness was on examination by Mr. Bissett. Sir, I will remind you you're still under the oath, and I gave to you before we go through it.
Yes, sir.
Bissett, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Detective, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Did you have an occasion back on the 29th of April 2017 to make any observations about anything in the footwell of the driver's area of the vehicle, the 2004 Impala?
No, sir.
At any point in time on the 2nd of May, did you have an opportunity to process that, if that's the date that you processed the vehicle? Did you notice any tennis shoes in the driver's footwell area where the pedals are?
I'd have to refer to the pictures. I don't recall off the top of my head.
That's the original first 20 or so photos. Not that it came in here, but came in the other day.
When y'all processed the vehicle at Law&Crime Derrick, did you take another set of photos?
Yes, sir.
And based on your recollection of what we did before launch, those photos aren't in evidence here. Is that your understanding?
I don't recall seeing those. I recall seeing a couple of them, but I didn't have a chance to actually count to see if they were all here.
Directing your attention to states 66 and 67.
Yes, sir.
In the footwell, do you make any observations whether there's any footwear in there?
Yes, sir. There appears to be a shoe.
When you were at Law&Crime Derrick, would you have collected those?
No, we didn't collect them.
And you did a thorough search. I think you guys even took the spare tire out. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
With respect to the positions of the seats, if one were ever to do any reconstruction work on shooting placement, did you mark or take any measurements as to where the seats, the front seats that are adjustable, were prior to towing the car off of Barron?
No, sir, we did not.
Did you put any evidence tape over the, if they were power seats, any evidence tape over the switches so you know if they'd been adjusted or moved?
No, sir. No, sir, we didn't.
Thank you, Detective. Pass the witness.
Judge, there's a new line of questioning that came up in response to the defense, and I'd like for Mr. Lewis to do this with the court's permission.
Go ahead. Just a couple follow-up questions, if I may, Your Honor. Detective Whaley, I'm going to show you. I'm going to mark as State Exhibit number 284A for now. Can you tell me what that is?
This was an item received from the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office.
Okay. And what is it?
Projectile fragments.
And that's from the autopsy of Jordan Edwards?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And how did it get to court today, sir?
I contacted our property master and had him bring it up from our property room.
Okay. And, all right. And I'm going to also show you what's been marked as States number 285. What is that?
These were test fires that were conducted on the rifle, the AR-15 rifle, out of Swifts.
And just for the record, States 285 came out of States 229A, the box containing the 223 rifle, States exhibit number 229. Is that correct?
Correct, sir.
I'm going to offer States exhibits, 285 for now, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I don't believe the entire predicate's been read. If they're conditionally offered them subsequent to future witnesses tying together, we don't have any other objections than what we've already raised.
Those objections are noted if they're time up later, they're admissible. Right now, they're admissible for record purposes only.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. 285.
You only offered two.
Correct.
Okay.
So 285 is for record purposes at this time. 284A contains one brown envelope, projectile fragments from the autopsy of Jordan Edwards. For record purposes as well right now.
Submitted for record purposes only.
Thank you. Passing with us at this time.
Detective, as part of your crime scene, did you have an occasion to talk to any medical personnel or EMTs about whether or not they adjusted that front right seat?
No, sir.
Did you make any observations as to what was underneath on the floorboard on the front right side? Was there, Mr. Snipes asked you about soft drink or drink beverages in that area. Was there a speaker to your recollection down in the footwell on the front right side?
I believe there was.
Thank you. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Stubs time for Mr. Lewis.
Doesn't very well.
May he be finally excused or subject to recall?
Given that he's the main guy subject to recall, Judge.
Sir, you may stand down. It's possible you might be recalled as a witness, so
Yes,
please don't discuss the testimony in your arrest. Who's going to be up on the stage?
That's going to be Detective Juan Carranza. Before we do that, Judge, we got some exhibits we want to offer that have business records affidavits.
All right, go ahead.
Mr. Gill has one.
I've got on mine.
This is State's Exhibit 24, which shows Tarrant County College records of the defendant. State's Exhibit 21, which is the ball springs firearms policy. State's Exhibit 22, which is the subject of less lethal weapons. State's Exhibit 260, which is a certificate pertaining to the defendant on his training and use of force. 261, a certificate of completion from crisis intervention training. 262.
Is that about the defendant?
Yes, sir. Which is also his patrol rifle update training for the defendant. I believe there's an objection, Judge.
No.
And then State's Exhibit 23, which is the general orders pertaining to body cam videos.
Mr. Brissett, do you have any objections to any of those exhibits?
No, Your Honor, the state was gracious enough to give us those some months ago, and they've had Mr. Oliver's training records in his 201 file, so we have no objections to any of that.
Okay. Thank you for that. 23, 24, 21, 22, 260, and 261, and 262 are admitted for all purposes. How do you wish to publish those?
I'll do that later, Judge.
Yes, sir. If you wouldn't mind, then, as you call Mr. Carranza, would you hand those to the court? The exhibits that you just submitted, yes, sir. And you can call Officer Carranza. Go ahead.
Ready?
Mr. Brissett. Sir? If you would please come to the front of the courtroom. Before you have a seat, once you step, please raise your right hand. Swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth.
Yes, sir.
Please have a seat. Whose witness will this be? Do we answer any questions from Mr. Snipes and perhaps also Mr. Brissett? You may proceed.
Detective Carranza, please state your full name, spell your first and last name for the record.
My name's Juan Carranza. First name spelling Juan, last name spelling Carranza.
How are you currently employed, sir?
I'm employed by the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. I'm assigned to the Criminal Investigation Section as a detective.
Are you a certified police officer, sir?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been in law enforcement?
29 years, sir.
And when did you join the Dallas County Sheriff's Office?
In September 1989.
So you've been here the whole time?
I was gone for a brief 4-month period, but I was reinstated.
What all duties have you had in Dallas County?
I began in September 1989 as a civilian detention officer, and then in 1993 I was accepted to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office Academy for a deputy sheriff position. I returned to the jail from 94 to 96, and then in 96 I was transferred to the Warrant Execution Division for 9 years.
And as far as the Dallas County Sheriff's Office goes, were you the lead investigator in this case?
Yes, sir, I was.
And is this case actually a hybrid case by way of investigation along with my office?
Yes, sir.
And so my investigators and you work hand in hand for a large portion of this investigation?
Yes, we did.
Before I forget to do this, and just to clear this up, there were search warrants, 2 of them, on the 2004 Chevrolet Impala, and the suggestion was made that there was no crime involved or that it didn't pertain to the defendant. Can you explain to the jury what the probable cause crime was in each of those search warrants?
The probable cause crime was the main reason for the search warrants were to collect pertinent evidence related to the investigation. Also was to determine path trajectory.
The investigation and prosecution of the defendant, correct?
Yes, sir.
I want to direct your attention to the time frame of April 29th, April 30th of last year, 2017.
Shouldn't be any cell phones unless you've had permission from the court. So please remove the cell phones from the court.
Yes, sir.
Man, is it powered off, man? Thank you very much. We'll give it to you right at the break. Go ahead.
Thanks, sir. And ultimately, those crimes as presented to this jury were aggravated assault, deadly weapon by a public servant, murder, right?
Yes.
Taking your attention to April 29th, April 30th, were you on duty those days?
Yes, I was on call. It was my weekend.
Okay, what does it mean to be on call?
I'm off on Saturdays and Sundays, but it was my turn to be on call, the on-call detective. So the call for the request from the Balch Springs Police Department came in around shortly after midnight on April 30th.
This is Balch Springs, and you're Dallas County. Do you know why you were called in to assist on this case?
Yes.
Okay, tell the ladies and gentlemen, jury.
The Balch Springs Police Department contacted the Dallas County Sheriff's Office Communications Section, and they were requesting assistance from us to conduct an investigation for an officer-involved shooting that occurred shortly after 11 p.m. on Saturday, April 29, 2017.
And were you the only person from the Dallas County Sheriff's Office that went out to the scene of Barron Drive and Shepherd Lane on the early morning hours of April 30th?
I was only detective on call, but you know, obviously this was a big case, and I had to request assistance from other detectives in my office.
Who went out there with you?
Detective Feder went out there with me. Also, my supervisor, Kevin Fineglass, and our lieutenant at the time, Howard Sparks, and our crime scene was also requested out there.
That being the man that just testified?
Yes, sir.
How about Sergeant Fassett? Was he out there with you?
Yeah, he was there.
What time approximately did you get to the crime scene? If you need to refer to your report, you can. But if you remember, just tell me.
Approximately 1 a.m. I arrived at the crime scene. There were actually 2 crime scenes, so I arrived in the area about 1 a.m.
And when you say 2 crime scenes, one was at Barron and Shepherd and the other one down on Bishop, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And this was a criminal investigation, is that right?
Yes, I conduct criminal investigations. I don't conduct administrative or internal affairs investigations. That's another section in our office.
Did you have any involvement at all with any kind of internal affairs investigation pertaining that was done by Balm Springs?
Not at all.
So you get there at 1 o'clock in the morning, what do you do?
Well, I get there about 1 a.m. I meet up with Sergeant Fineglass and Lieutenant Sparks at the time. I meet with Detective Whaley and Sergeant Fassett, assess the scene. When I initially get there, I notice an ambulance from Acadian Services at the 4200 block of Shepherd. I asked them to guide me where the crime scene is. They tell me, well, one's here and one's down the street. Everyone is down the street on Bishop, so I head to that direction.
When you say I head to that direction, you mean Bishop?
To Bishop, yes. Though
Why
I
were you
believe
going down there?
because that's where the black Impala was that had the 5 occupants at the time.
By the time you got down there, were there any occupants left in that car, or what was the situation?
No, the young man, the decedent, had been transported to Baylor Hospital downtown, and the other occupants were at the time being detained in Balk Springs police vehicles on that street on Bishop Drive.
Was Jordan Edwards still down there, or had he been care flighted out by that time?
Yeah, he'd been transported to Baylor Hospital.
So you get down to Bishop, and then what did you do?
So I basically meet with Detective Bird from Balk Springs and Sergeant Waltz from Balk Springs, and I asked them to briefly tell me what happened, and they tell me that the incident started at the 4200 block of Shepherd.
And let me stop you there. The reason you got this information is not because that you were believing it then, but this was the basis for your subsequent action that night. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Go ahead.
So they tell me it started at a house party on Barron Drive. They tell me who's involved. They tell me that one of the officers that was involved was over on 4200 block of Shepherd. They tell me that the shooting occurred on Shepherd and Barron, and that the decedent had been transported to Baylor Hospital.
And let me stop you there. And so then you have this knowledge. What did you do by way of your investigation subsequent to that? After that? After you've learned what supposedly transpired, what did you do on the ground physically?
Yeah, we went and inspected the vehicle that was involved.
Who's we?
Detective Fetter and I. By that time, Detective Fetter had arrived. We inspected the vehicle. We observed some bullet holes on the side passenger, on the passenger side window, on the front windshield. We saw some cell phones outside the doors. There was blood on the console and on the seat. So after that, we allowed Detective Whaley to conduct to finish off is processing the crime scene.
Detective Whaley that just testified in front of the jury?
Yes, sir.
All right. What time is it now?
It's probably about a little after 2, and then the Public Integrity Unit from the Dallas County District Attorney's Office arrived on scene. We basically briefed them on what had taken place at the time, the little few details that we had, and they did the walkthrough from one crime scene to the other.
And they is George and Mr. Hermes back here?
Yes, sir.
And some investigators. All right, go ahead.
So we got that out of the way, and they asked us to give them an update as soon as it became available.
And what time did you clear that area out at Barron Drive and Bishop that night?
I would say sometime about 6 a.m., 6:20 a.m. And
very soon thereafter, did you guys start interviewing potential witnesses, mostly teenagers?
yeah, the main witnesses, the occupants in the vehicle, they were being interviewed. They were being interviewed here in this building downstairs on the first floor by other detectives in our office.
Were you there when Detective Creer found the shell casings in the parking lot of the nursing home?
Yes, that was.
The jury about that?
Yes, we had just finished doing the preliminary autopsy at the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office sometime around 7:45. I'm sorry, about 8:30 a.m. We returned to the crime scene at approximately 9 a.m. and there were other detectives from our office on Shepherd, and we had determined that the initial gunshots that were fired out there that kind of started this whole thing had been fired in the vicinity of that nursing home. So we returned when it was daylight, and one of our detectives in our office located 12 spent shell casings on the ground. It was difficult to locate them because it was dark that night, so we really couldn't know. Although we had flashlights and whatnot, it was dark, cold, and it had rained really hard earlier that night. So we figured that with daylight we could maybe locate additional evidence, and that's what happened.
And then did you develop what you believe was probable cause to arrest the defendant later that week?
Yes, after not completing the investigation, but following up with it a few more days, on May 5th, yes, I generated an arrest warrant for the defendant.
And was that probable cause based mainly on the witnesses that you'd interviewed and then your examination of the 2 relevant body cameras?
Yes, sir.
Pass the witness, Judge.
Cross-examination.
I'm looking for some blue backs, Judge, but thank you.
Good afternoon, Detective.
Good
How are
afternoon.
you?
Fine, sir, thank you.
Defense Exhibit 6, is that your arrest warrant for Officer Oliver?
Yes, sir, it is.
What day did you obtain that?
On May the 5th, 2017.
In case members of the jury don't know, you have to lay out a specific crime, correct?
Crime of murder?
Yes, sir. You have to list, there's 5,300 approximately jailable offenses in Texas. And jailable meaning Class B or higher than a traffic ticket. And you have the ability to arrest on any one of those, correct?
Yes.
And if it's not an on-view or on-scene arrest, you have to get a warrant from a judge, correct?
Yes.
And you tell the judge in your warrant, whether it's an arrest warrant or search warrant, what the charge is and what the facts are to support it, correct?
Yes.
Show you what's been marked and admitted for the record as Defense Exhibit 7. Do you recognize that, sir?
Yes, sir, I do.
And does that bear your signature at different points?
Yes.
And is that a search warrant for the vehicle that Mr. Snipes asked you about?
Yes, it is.
Now, if I understand from the last witness, y'all met back up in the first floor of this building sometime early Sunday morning, correct?
I'm sorry, who?
Well, the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, the ones that are figuring out this shooting investigation.
Yes, we met back up here that Sunday morning.
And you got caught up and you looked at the in-car video at that time, is that correct? Or the body worn?
Sunday morning, I believe, yes. I think, yeah, we looked at it.
How did you come in possession of the body worn?
We collected it that day, that Sunday morning, we collected it from the Balk Springs Police.
Can you tell me the process by which you collected it?
We just asked them for it.
Now the question is, what's it? Did you ask for the whole camera?
The SD cards.
You took the SD cards on that date?
Yes, sir.
Would it surprise you that the crime scene logs don't have those being collected till mid-May?
I believe that was the actual body cameras that were collected.
So at some point, the body cameras and the micro SD cards separated from themselves?
And really, I can't tell you right now, I don't recall if it was the SD cards or it was just an actual DVD that they made for us.
And as far as Dallas County Sheriff's concerned, you are what I would refer to and others as the case agent. You're the lead guy.
Yes, sir.
Buck stops with you.
Pretty much, yes.
All the paperwork for this case, as far as Dallas County is concerned, for the Sheriff's Department, flows through you. You're the lead agent.
Yes, sir.
You have your report with you. You can tell the jury exactly when you and how you got the video Sunday morning to review.
I have my case report, but I don't think it's stated on there how I obtained it. But if I recall correctly, the Balk Springs Police Department provided us with a DVD of both of the cameras.
Y'all went back out to the scene that Sunday afternoon, correct?
We did, yes.
And you were present, I guess, around 5:20 Sunday morning when my friend Roy Oliver over here did a walkthrough with you to tell you what took place, right?
Yes.
And Lieutenant Merritt from Balch Springs was there, correct?
There was a lieutenant there from Balk Springs. I couldn't even tell you his name. I mean, I know it now because I've heard it, but even at that day, I didn't know his name.
On direct, you referred to this area as 2 crime scenes, correct?
Yes.
Any idea why the lead crime scene officer would only refer to the area as 1 crime scene?
1 crime scene. I mean, it was off the 4200 block of Shepherd and 12224 Bishop Drive.
And there was a third one at the nursing home the next morning. You guys had 3 crime scenes, really?
Yes, you could say that, yes.
At some point on Sunday, you go home, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is this a criminal investigation at that point?
Yes, it is.
With a criminal investigation, you would assign one of those 5,300 crimes to this in your reports and your narratives, correct?
Yes.
If it's a criminal investigation, come Monday, May 1st, when you swear out an arrest or a search warrant affidavit, you would assign the crime to that as well, correct?
Yes.
I'm going to read you a sentence. I want you to tell me what the crime is in Texas. There is, it says, suspected vehicle and premise, personal property concealed and kept in violation of the laws of Texas and described as follows. Conduct trajectory, bullet path determination, collect cell phones, blood samples, firearms, and it's fire, F-I-R, space, A-R-M-S, bullet projectiles, shell casings, and or any evidence inside a vehicle that is related to this police-involved shooting incident.
Yes.
I don't see the word homicide here.
At that point, that was on May 1st.
Yes,
at that point, I was still not, I still did not feel that I had the appropriate charge to charge Mr. Oliver.
And where I'm trying to get to, Detective, is the use of search warrants and, say, grand jury subpoenas are only for once somebody has determined there is a criminal offense. Because the grand jury and search warrants can't come into play unless you have a chargeable offense that's jailable. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
So when you swore out this search warrant before God and country on Monday afternoon, what was the chargeable offense?
Well, we were looking at murder, but I still wasn't certain that was murder, that charge was going to apply.
The recitation of the facts in this first search warrant, was the first search warrant's recitations what you have today as your opinion as to what took place?
Yes.
You go on and you talk about the direction of the vehicle as Officer Gross is walking up to it. You recall that?
Yes.
That Officer Gross is giving multiple commands to stop a vehicle.
Yes.
The hearsay.
You had a chance to do a walkthrough with Officer Gross, correct?
Yes.
You had a chance to look at State's Exhibits 8, 10, and all of Mr. Frederick's work here, correct?
Yes.
And you've met with Mr. Snipes probably a dozen plus times, have you not?
I don't know, about several times. I can't tell you how many.
During those times, have you watched that in-car video?
Yes.
Anything to think that Officer Gross's actions out there were anything different than what an officer should be doing if he thinks he has a legal right to stop a vehicle?
He did what was appropriate.
Okay. Let's go back to the party then and go through the appropriateness here. Was it appropriate the way Officer Gross and Officer Oliver came out of the house to what everybody I think concedes was gunfire?
I think it was appropriate for them to come out to try to investigate, try to determine, if it may have been an active shooter situation. I don't know what they were thinking.
Was it appropriate for Officer Gross to go up the road to investigate?
Yes.
Based on your investigation, you had a chance to look at Balch Springs general orders, correct?
No.
Part of your determination for your arrest warrant then for homicide, you never looked at the general orders of Balch Springs?
No, I didn't.
Did you ever, in the time before you went and got this warrant at the end of the week, did you look at Officer Oliver's T-code service records for police officers?
No.
Did you look at his 201 file for the military to see what kind of combat veteran he was?
I did not, but I learned out there through some of the officers that they mentioned to me that he had been in combat and a couple of tours in Iraq or somewhere.
Can you direct me in your offense report where you recorded that information, because I don't recall it?
It's not in my case report.
Isn't it part of your general orders for the Dallas County Sheriff's Department as a person assigned to CID to make detailed and copious notes of all engagements, including the date and time and who you spoke to?
It is, but I didn't put it in there.
It is, but you proceeded at the end of that week to swear out an arrest warrant for murder for my client, correct?
Yes.
And you swore out an arrest warrant for murder for my client, and you didn't have all the facts yet, did you?
I had enough. Yeah.
Was it appropriate for Officer Oliver to go to his patrol vehicle and obtain his long gun?
I think it's appropriate. nothing wrong with that.
Is it appropriate then for Officer Oliver then to chamber a round? Because their policy said they had to keep it not only in the vehicle secure, but in the vehicle secure without a round in the chamber?
It was, to me, it's appropriate if he chambered around, yes.
Was it appropriate for him to proceed and head toward Shepard to back up his partner?
Yes.
You had a chance to make some auditory observations of the video of Officer Gross and Officer Oliver that night as well as your visual ones?
Yes.
Do you recall a period of time where Officer Gross's voice changed on the audio as he's calling out a license plate?
I recall him calling out the license plate a couple of times. I recall him referring to the vehicle as a black Cadillac at one point. But I don't recall the change in his voice, no.
Hypothetically then, if Officer Gross's voice did change to a higher pitch, do you think it'd be appropriate for his partner to pick up the pace in closed ground to get up closer to where he is to investigate?
Yes.
Is there an international symbol for your 23 years of law enforcement that if a patrol officer or peace officer unholsters his weapon, that any other cop around might look and say, hey, something's not right here?
I mean, he can unholster his weapon if he's in fear of his life.
And would you expect his backup to make observations of that if he's in a trailing position?
Yes.
Would you expect his backup then to take that as a clue to add to the totality of the circumstances that he must interpret as he's going up there?
I don't know what Mr. Oliver was thinking. You know, all what you just mentioned, I think it's appropriate. But when he decided to fire those rounds into that vehicle, no.
So that's what I'm trying to get to, Detective. That's the only thing about Officer Oliver's actions leading up to the shots being fired you don't think was reasonable or appropriate, correct?
Correct.
So it's that split-second decision, red light, green light. If there's a defense there, it's just that split-second decision that we have to judge Officer Oliver on. Do you agree with that, right?
Yes.
And the tragic loss and everything that takes place once the first trigger is pulled is based on and judgment on that decision, red light, green light, clear to shoot, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Ask the witness.
Mr. Brissett talked about the appropriateness of the behavior of the defendant that night. Was it appropriate for him to shoot 5 rounds into that car, putting at risk 5 young men?
No, sir, not at all.
And murdering Jordan Edwards? Anything appropriate about that?
No, sir, not at all.
That's all I have, Judge.
Subject to recall because I have nothing else for him.
Sir, you may stand down. It's possible you might be recalled as a witness, so please don't discuss your testimony with anybody else.
Yes, sir.
It says the statement, Mr. Brissett.
Okay.
Mr. Lewis is taking over now, Judge.
State will call Dr. Waleska Castro now.
You said that. Thank you.
Judge, can I have this one second?
I messed her up.
Y'all can stand up too. You need to go. Members of the jury, we're going to take, members of the public, members of the jury too. We're going to take a short recess. If you would please, all rise for the jurors. See you all in approximately. Thank you, Sheriff. You all may be seated. Before we recognize the Honorable George Lewis.
State calls Dr. Waleska Castro.
You may please stand in front of the courtroom. Before you have a seat, could you raise your hand? You swear the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth.
I do.
Please have a seat. Respond to questions from Mr. Lewis and at any time. Who will speak to Mr. Gibbons? You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Castro. How are you doing today?
Good.
please state your name and spell it for the court reporter?
My name is Waleska Castro. It spells Waleska
And Dr. Castro, how are you currently employed, ma'am?
I am a trace evidence examiner at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences, also known as Dallas County Crime Laboratory, also known as SWIFS.
And how long have you been with SWIFS?
5 years and a half.
And what does a trace evidence examiner do?
A trace evidence examiner will look at evidence that trace materials that can be transferred or left behind in a crime. An example of these materials could be gunshot residue, hairs, fibers, glass, ignitable liquid residues, among others.
Can you please explain for the jury your education, your experience for your position?
I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a master's degree in chemistry from University of Puerto Rico. I also have a PhD in chemistry from Florida International University. Additional to that, I went through training at SWIFS for the analysis of gunshot residue using the equipment or technique called scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray spectrometry, or SEM-EDS. I am currently proficient at performing this test.
And for the members of the jury, what is gunshot residue?
When a firearm is fired, the primer mixture inside the ammunition will initiate an explosion, and this explosion will produce high pressure and hot vapors inside the gun. These high pressure and hot vapors will push the bullet out of the gun. When the vapors escape after the bullet, they escape primarily through the muzzle of the gun, but any openings or gaps in that firearm, when the vapors escape, they will eventually transform in what is called gunshot residue particles. These gunshot residue particles will have a specific chemistry and a specific morphology or shape. Particles that are characteristic of gunshot residue will contain the chemical elements antimony, barium, and lead, and the only known source of particles characteristic of gunshot residue is from discharging a firearm. There are other types of particles consistent with gunshot residue. This type of particles could have a combination of two chemical elements. It could be either barium and aluminum, or barium and lead, or barium and antimony. These particles could come from discharging a firearm, but also could come from other environmental sources. These particles in general are very small, in the range of 1 micron to 100 micron, and these are the particles that we look at with the instrument or technique I mentioned before.
Now, specifically pertaining to laboratory number IFS-17-0795, with respect to a complainant by the name of Jordan Javon Edwards, were you asked to conduct a gunshot residue analysis pertaining to that specific lab number?
Yes, I did.
What evidence was submitted to you so that you could perform this analysis?
A gunshot residue evidence collection kit containing sample stubs from Jordan Javon Edwards.
I'm sorry, hang on one second. Yes, sir.
I assume at some point this evidence is going to be tied to a collection event. We haven't heard that yet.
Okay, see the lawyers on the side of the bench. As you clear that up, Mr. Gill, I'm going to overrule your objection, subject to the condition of relevance, tying it together for later rules. You may proceed.
Ms. Castro, you had testified that you received certain items of evidence. Could you please go over that again?
The laboratory received the gunshot residue evidence collection kit containing sample stubs from Jordan Javon Edwards.
And where did that come from?
It came from the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office.
And the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office. Is that who performs autopsies?
Yes.
So this evidence would have been collected during the autopsy of Jordan Javon Edwards?
Yes.
Okay. And specifically, you received sample stubs from both hands, is that correct, left and right?
From the back of the left hand and from the back of the right hand.
Could you please describe for the members of the jury how you actually performed this analysis?
So the sample stubs collected from the back of the left hand and the back of the right hand were submitted to the laboratory, and I just put those sample stubs inside the SEM EDS, and I started an automated analysis that will look at the surface of those sample stubs, and it will look for particles. Once it detected a particle, it will collect an X-ray spectrum, and that X-ray spectrum will have a specific chemistry, and based on that chemistry, the automated analysis will assign a class to that particle. Once the analysis is done, I will go and look at those particles that were classified as gunshot-residue. I will confirm those particles as gunshot-residue particles if they were present, and those particles will be the ones that I will put in a report.
So to describe for the members of the jury the analysis that you conducted in this particular case as it pertains to the samples that you received from Jordan Javon Edwards.
If that's the exact same thing I did? Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, just kind of describe, well, let's just cut to the chase. What were the results of the analysis that you performed on this case regarding Jordan Javon Edwards?
I found two particles consistent with primer gunshot residue. They were confirmed on the sample stub from the back of the left hand of Jordan Javon Edwards. These particles will consist of the elemental profile barium aluminum and are considered to be consistent with gunshot residue. However, some environmental sources could produce similar particles. Primer gunshot residue particles were not detected on the sample stub collected from the back of the right hand of Jordan Javon Edwards.
Okay, so just so the jury is clear, two particles on the back of the left hand consistent with primer gunshot residue, is that correct?
Yes.
And none on the back of the right hand?
Correct.
When you say consistent with, can you describe for the members of the grand jury what that means?
So as I mentioned before, there are two types of particles. The particles characteristic of gunshot residue will have a specific chemistry, and the particles consistent with gunshot residue could have a combination of two chemical elements. Particles consistent with gunshot residue could come from discharging a firearm, but also could come from other environmental sources.
When you say these other environmental sources, can you give them some examples of that?
Yes, this particular elemental profile has been appearing, or they can be found on fireworks when they are used, or also in some deployed airbags, car airbags.
Okay. Now, are you familiar with, is it possible that gunshot residue may be transferred from one source to another?
Yes, if I fired a firearm and I immediately go and touch another surface like a doorknob or put my hands in my pockets, that will potentially transfer gunshot residue from my hands to that doorknob or my pockets or any other surface that I touch.
So hypothetically speaking, if I were to fire a firearm and then come up to you and take your pulse, is it possible that I could transfer the gunshot residue on my hands onto your hands?
It is possible.
Now, were you aware that there was a gunshot residue analysis conducted prior to yours? And for the record, your analysis was conducted, or your report date is February 5th, 2018, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you aware that there was another analysis done prior to yours, specifically with regard to gunshot residue analysis?
Yes, there was another analysis done on the exact same gunshot residue kit from Jordan Edwards, and it was done by another trace evidence examiner at SWIFT's.
And what was that examiner's name?
Ms. Kara Crosby, K-A-R-A-C-R-O-S-S-W-Y.
And what was the report date on her analysis?
May 19, 2017.
Now, when your analysis is complete, does it go through some kind of technical review process?
Yes, once I finish my analysis and I look at everything and I'm ready to finalize my report, I pass it to another trace evidence examiner qualified on doing gunshot-residue analysis, and that person will do what is called a technical review, and it will look at not only typos or whether the wordings make sense, but also will look at the technical data to make sure that everything is correct and in agreement with what I'm trying to report.
And was that review process done with regard to your analysis?
Yes.
And what were the results of the review?
It passed. There is no result itself. The result is like once the technical reviewer looks at everything and it approves, there is a special form that the technical reviewer signs certifying that he has technically reviewed and it approved all my notes and everything. And then I finalize the report.
Okay. So going back, you had made reference to Garrick Whaley performing an analysis prior to yours. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is Garrick Whaley still with Swift today?
No.
You know where she is?
I believe she's in Florida.
Okay. And to your understanding, is that the reason why you were asked to conduct another analysis?
Yes.
Okay. You'd also referred to the review process that's done after analysis is complete. Did you conduct a technical review of Ms. Crosswise analysis?
Yes.
Can you tell the members of the jury what the results of her analysis were?
They were complete and the report and everything was correct, and therefore there is a report. If the technical review wouldn't be okay, there wouldn't be a report.
Okay. What were the conclusions that she came to in her report?
Yes, everything was fine, so she was able to finalize the report.
Okay, so specifically with regard to her analysis, what were her conclusions?
5 particles consistent with primer gunshot residue were confirmed on the sample stock collected from the back of the left hand of Jordan Javon Edwards. These particles consist of the elemental profile barium aluminum and are considered to be consistent with primer gunshot residue. However, some environmental sources could produce similar particles. Primer gunshot residue particles were not detected on the sample stock collected from the back of the right hand of Jordan Edwards.
So similar to your analysis, no particles were found on the back of Jordan's right hand, is that correct?
Correct.
However, she found 5 particles consistent with primer gunshot residue, and you found 2, is that right?
Yes.
Can you explain to the members of the jury how that can occur?
The reason for the discrepancy in the number of particles could come from the way the instrument and the analysis happens. These sample stubs are put inside the instrument on a specific orientation. Her orientation may be slightly different from mine. When I put the same stubs in the instrument, and when we sample the stub, we don't look at the entire surface. We just look at a portion from the center. And so anything in the edge of the sample stub, if it has a different orientation than mine, could have been missed. But what matters is that whether you have 1 particle or 5 particles or however many particles, the results will be the same. The number of particles is not necessarily giving you any other information. This test is based on whether there is presence or absence of gunshot residue. So 1 particle present or 5 or 10 is still the same result.
So simply put, you and Ms. Crosswhite could have been looking at different sections of the same sample stub, is that correct?
Correct.
Dr. Castro, I'm going to show you what's been marked as States Exhibits 247 as well as 246. You could please explain to the jury what those are.
States Exhibit 247, it's a copy of my report on IFS 1707795, request 0022. States Exhibit 246, it's a copy of Garrick Whaley's report on the case IFS 1707795, request 0008.
And is it the ordinary course of business for SWIFTs to have these reports made for these analyses?
Yes.
And were these reports made at or near the time that these analyses occurred?
Yes.
And these are fair and accurate copies of reports by both you and Ms. Crosswise, is that correct?
They appear to be.
Time the state's going to offer State Exhibits number 246 and 247.
We object to both because they're hearsay. We object to both because they're cumulative. And we object to 246 because the United States Constitution gives us a confrontation clause right to confront the maker of the report.
Can I see this, please?
Yes, sir.
Objection to 246 is sustained. Objection to 247 is overruled.
Yes.
You have a running objection to 247. 246 I'll admit for record purposes.
So Dr. Castro, you indicated after you stated the lab number IFS-17-077995, you also listed a request number. Specifically as pertains to your report, it was 0022. What does that request number mean?
That is just the way we keep track in the case file management system, each analysis or request that enters for that particular IFS number.
Thank you, Doctor. I pass the witness, John.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Castro.
Good afternoon.
How are you this afternoon?
Good.
So you performed analysis pursuant to request number 0022,
Yes.
and Ms. Crosswine conducted testing pursuant to request number 0008. Is that right?
Correct.
So before you got a hold of this case, there had been 21 other requests processed through SWIFTs. Is that right?
Yes.
And you did your analysis in February of 2018?
The report date was February 5th, 2018.
Do you do the report contemporaneously with or soon after you've conducted the analysis?
Yes.
And Ms. Crosswhite did her work in, what, May of 2017?
Correct.
So you described, basically described for the jury what gunpowder residue is that right?
I described what is Gunshot-Residue. Yes.
All right. Well, there are actually two different types of gunshot residue, is that right?
This test looks for primer gunshot residue, and we look at two different types of particles that could come from discharging a firearm. The one that I mentioned was characteristic of gunshot residue, that those particles, the only known source is from discharging a firearm. Particles consistent with gunshot residue could come from discharging a firearm, but also from other environmental sources, as I mentioned before.
All right. So particles that are characteristic of gunshot residue contain all three of the elements. Is that correct?
Yes, it will contain barium, antimony, and lead, and it will have a specific morphology as well.
Barium, antimony, and lead.
Barium, antimony, and lead.
Particles that have only two of those three elements you classify as consistent with primer gunshot residue. Is that right?
Yes.
But particles that are consistent with gunpowder residue can also be from the environment.
Yes, as I mentioned before, in this particular case, the particles consistent with gunshot residue found on the sample stubs for Jordan Edwards had an elemental profile of barium aluminum, and there are some fireworks that will produce particles with the morphology and the chemistry of barium aluminum, similar to the ones produced from discharging a firearm.
Have you also heard that those elements come from some brake pads?
It will depend on the particles consistent with gunshot residue that will have a more elemental profile of barium and lead could come from brake pads. But barium aluminum, which is this case mostly from fireworks or some deployed airbags from a car.
Well, you said that the three elements that are characteristic of gunpowder residue are barium, antimony, and lead.
Correct.
And then you said that you found particles that are consistent because they can't contain barium and aluminum.
Correct. These other type of particles are present and are associated to the discharge of a firearm, even though they don't have antimony or lead. They just have barium and aluminum, and that comes from the primer mixture inside the ammunition.
Okay, so primer mixtures also contain some amount of aluminum, is that right?
Yeah, it depends on the type of mixture.
Well, you don't know what type of mixture was involved in this case, do you?
No.
So would you describe to the jury how someone actually goes about examining an item to see if it contains primer gunshot residue? What do you use and how do you use it?
So basically, if there is a surface, it could be a hand or it could be clothing or a table, that you're suspected to have gunshot residue on it, you will collect residues from that surface using a sample stub. And then that sample stub is submitted to the laboratory. The sample stub basically is an aluminum push pin that has a flat round surface, and on that surface it has sticky tape. So you will dab that sticky tape against that surface, presumably having gunshot residue, and then you close, it's held on a base, and you close it so to protect any contamination from other sources, and then it's submitted to the laboratory, and the process for analysis, what I already described.
Okay, so you take that stub which you created and you put it under a scanning electron microscope, is that right?
The stubs collected from any surface, yeah, you will put that stub inside the scanning electron microscope.
And then you examine the surface of the stub.
Correct.
And you described earlier how if you're not looking at the stub the same way that the previous examiner might have looked at it, you might find something different. Is that correct?
Let's clarify. I don't look at anything. The instrument searches the surface of the sample stub. And when she loaded her samples, the orientation on that could have been slightly different than my orientation when I put the sample stubs inside the chamber. And we don't look at the entire surface of the stub because we don't want the instrument to go and detect particles in a neighboring stub by mistake. So we are looking at some portion of the stub to make sure that we are just in that stub and we're not going outside of the stub of analysis or interest. So that's pretty much my explanation.
Okay. Well, is it part of your explanation that you might load up stubs from 2 or 3 or more different cases at one time to look at under your scanning electron microscope?
Typically, we would do that. We will run the analysis in batch. We can add multiple kits in one analysis run. But in this particular case, I just did this GSR kit.
Okay, so there wasn't any, you didn't have any concern here about getting across the boundary and into another case then, did you?
Well, I could go next to the other stub from the left. I could go on the other stub from the right.
You ever put a blank in your scanning electron microscope?
Yes, that as well. We have a negative control.
Well, you could have put a negative control between the two stubs, couldn't you?
Could, yeah.
But you didn't find anything on the stub from the right hand of George Javon Edwards, did you?
On the right hand, no. There were no GSR
Nothing characteristic of gunshot residue, nothing consistent with gunshot residue.
Nothing characteristic or consistent with gunshot residue.
Is it also possible that the stub itself was not completely round, and that's why you were not able to examine the full surface of the stub?
These stubs are, I think they are the D shape they have on the, it's not a complete circle, but we do the analysis from the center, and it doesn't go all the way to the edges of the sample stub. So anything on the edges could have been different from her orientation than mine.
Okay, so we got to be careful about getting over to the edge of the earth on this stuff, right?
Correct.
Okay. So as the scanning electron microscope is looking at these particles, is the scanning electron microscope looking at the morphology of the particle, or is it doing an actual chemical test?
The instrument will look at bright spots, and then when it detects a bright spot, it will collect an X-ray spectrum. And it will do that throughout the analysis, and when it's done, I will go and look at the particles that were classified as gunshot residue. And I, as an analyst, I am in charge of looking at the morphology, confirming, yes, this is a GSR particle or gunshot residue particle. It has the morphology and it has the chemistry. If it doesn't meet either of those criteria, it has to meet both. If it doesn't meet any of those, then I wouldn't confirm and it wouldn't be reported. It has to be round and specific morphology, and it must have a specific chemistry.
And as we use the term morphology, what does that mean?
Basically the shape of the particles.
So it has to have, before you can call it characteristic or consistent, it has to have the, number one, the shape, and also the chemical composition.
Correct.
Are there any other labs in North Texas that do primer gunshot residue analysis?
Yes.
Who are they?
I know Texas DPS and also Tarrant County medical examiners, and their laboratory perform gunshot residue analysis.
So both of those places have a scanning electron microscope that can do the same type of work you're doing, is that right?
I am assuming so. I haven't personally seen it, but if they are doing it, I am guessing they have a scanning electron microscope.
Because that's how this work is done, is that right?
It should be, yes.
Okay, that's industry standard for it, isn't it?
Correct.
Did anyone ever submit for your analysis or either paper bags that might have come from the hands of Jordan Javon Edwards, or SEM stubs that were taken from paper bags that might have been on Jordan Javon Edwards' hands?
No.
If you find primer gunshot residue on someone's hand, what does that mean?
So if I find particles characteristic of gunshot residue, which are the particles that are for sure coming from discharging a firearm, that could mean that a person either fired a firearm, or the person handled a firearm component, or an object with gunshot residue, or that person was in the proximity of the firearm when it was fired. Particles consistent with gunshot residue are, all I can say is that they could have come from discharging a firearm or from other environmental sources.
And in this case, since we only have particles that are consistent, we really can't say very much about this at all, can we?
All I can say is what I already stated from the report, that they could have come from discharging a firearm, but also from environmental sources.
Or from being around someone else who discharged a firearm, right?
If they are truly from discharging a firearm, which I cannot tell by this test, if truly they are from discharging a firearm, it could be the same possibilities as mentioned before for the three components or particles characteristic of gunshot residue.
Which, again, for the jury, what is that?
It could be a person fired a firearm, a person handled a firearm component, or an object with gunshot residue, or a person could have been in the proximity of the firearm when it was fired.
And really, when we boil all that down, what you could really say is that somehow two particles that are consistent with gunpowder, with gunshot residue now, with gunshot primer residue, somehow got on this kid's hands.
They were present. That's all I can
They were
tell
present. That's a
with
better
this
way of
test.
saying it. Pass the witness.
Just a couple brief questions, Your Honor. Dr. Castro, how many of these gunshot residue analyses have you performed in the course of your career?
A lot. I don't have a number, but in the 1,000.
Okay. And you testified in court as an expert witness in this field
Yes,
on few and many occasions.
maybe 30, 40 times.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Anything else?
We don't have anything else.
May she be finally excused?
She may.
Yes, Your Honor.
Ma'am, you may stand down. You're excused from any further service. Please don't discuss your testimony with anybody else. Mr. Lewis, call your next witness, please.
State calls Heather Francis.
Stand up and stretch your legs.